Welcome to you all for the T.H.P Chentharassery Memorial Lecture, which is jointly, indeed it is actually a program of Kerala Historical Council Research, and basically we are the host. University of Kerala is trying to host the program. So on behalf of the University of Kerala Historical Council, basically research and KCHR, and on behalf of all of us, I welcome all the dignitaries on the dais. So, T.H.P Chentharassery, a brief intro. Thiruvananthapuram Chentharassery, who left us in 2018, popularly known as T.H.P Chentharassery, was born on Odara near Tiruvalla in Pathanamthitta district of Kerala. His family was deeply involved in the Sadhujana Paripalana Sangham, and he was one of the foremost scholars, one of the first scholar indeed who had worked on the causes as well as the history of Dalits in Kerala, especially the contribution by 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞 and B.R. Ambedkar. So I'm not actually going to read the intro, but what I felt is he was reflecting on the life and the struggle of 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞 to make that the Dalit leaders were in the forefront of Kerala's renaissance, particularly Travancore's renaissance, as well as the social mobility and the kind of effort which has been done. So I am a native of Vizhinjam. Being a native of Vizhinjam and being a native, I studied at the school where 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞, it is actually near the 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞 Memorial place, and we have a very deep rooted connection with 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞. Especially I am from Vizhinjam, a fishing hamlet. When 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞 was basically done that struggle, historical struggle for education of Dalit, 1.5 years was been left without sowing as well as agrarian practice in that part of Thiruvananthapuram, basically currently now Thiruvananthapuram district. But what happened is that during that period they were resorted in the nearby fishing villages. So my historical route is actually connected with this oral history of how the Dalits were being accommodated in the fishing villages and being, in that sense, having a symbiotic relationship, though they have not been part of agrarian practice at that time. So they were doing fishing basically, or helping the fishers in the Vizhinjam or nearby the current port regions basically. So in that sense, historically we are connected. So this is a note which hardly you can see in the history books of Kerala. Even in Chentharassery's work, it is very difficult to see because it is a oral history which has happened in the early 20th century. So this is in our history that we are part of a community which is part of this larger helping each other. So in that sense, I am very thankful that the Kerala Council of Historical Research very positively asked us to host this particular function, and on behalf of University of Kerala, the Inter-University Centre was very delighted to be part of this larger endeavour of KCHR. So regarding Kalpana, I don't want to speak much on Kalpana because there is a chair and he will be also going to talk about, and alumni sharing, all of us are alumni. So thinking in that line is very, very elating. So the other point which I would like to formally do is inviting all of you to this program. So I am on behalf of the Inter-University Centre for Alternative Economics and the University of Kerala, KCHR. I would like to invite Professor K.N. Ganesh, the chairperson of KCHR, to formally chair the program. So welcome you, sir. And then Dr. Christabel is here. He is the head of the, she is the head of the Department of the Economics, and because Inter-University Center is under the Department of Economics. So on behalf of all of us, I welcome Dr. Christabel, and Dr. Fascia is here. So she is the program, program coordinator in fact. So on behalf of all of us, let me formally invite you to the event, as well as Dr. Dineshan. He cannot make today, so but in his absence also, he is basically the instrument behind all this activity. So on behalf of all of us, let me invite him also formally to this function. And we have none other than Dr. Kalpana Kannabiran to speak on the aspect of the Dalit marginalization and the importance of the history and the historicity of how one has to basically make the new normal and the new discourse into the foray. And I am very thankful as well as hopeful that she will be doing. And of course, her works are a reflection of the past. If you follow Professor Kannabiran, then you can understand the person who is so vocal about all this thing. And we are very fortunate to have you here. And I would like to welcome you formally to this program. And the last but not the least, but all the KCHF fraternity as well as University of Kerala fraternity is here, and many friends, Legit and Thiagu, many are here from different institutions, Rajan is here, and many of my friends, Rajiv and faculty members, then all other people who are here. So on behalf of all of us, let me invite all of you to this particular program, and we will have a nice session, hopefully. Thank you so much. So let me, now the mic is over to Professor King. Okay.
Dear friends, I am only an interlocutor in the actual lecture that is going to take place. So we have been conducting this lecture for the last few years. Last year we had Gopal Guru giving the lecture, and now we have another scholar in the same vein, Kalpana Kannabiran, with us, who has been working as a sociologist, socio-legal scholar, as well as a legally of basically legal studies, and particularly in sense of her father, K.G. Kannabiran, who is also he attracted my attention some time back when he was, actually I didn't know anything about it, but I started attracting my attention primarily because of the articles which he was writing in Economic and Political Week. And these articles were very interesting primarily because of the fact that they were the first articles which actually caught my attention regarding the legal issues in the so-called conflict, I will say so-called conflict between the Naxalites and the state in Andhra. That is how I got the attention, and it is he who actually drew the attention to the so-called, which is now very commonly used term, that is his encounter murders, which is something which actually he only actually put it forward, the legal issues behind it, how the state is actually went around annihilating a set of people who rightly or wrongly were actually contesting and fighting against the state, and they decided to sort of annihilate them in a specific way, legally annihilating. That is probably the way one should use it. So that is how I came across Kannabiran's articles, and later only I came to know about Kalpana, and particularly through one of my old friends, Neera Velayathan, and we were just talking about her. and that is how we came to know each other. Now, I'm just living here, and I'm sure that he is taking a very interesting topic regarding the relationship between caste and a curious set of people who one doesn't know whether they could be accommodated into the conventional caste system or not. And I leave it to her to speak on that, and therefore I'm stopping here and invite Professor Kalpana Kannabiran to give us lecture. Thank you very much.
That would be then 2 minutes. No, sorry. So we'll have the felicitation. I invite accordingly Dr. Christabel, the head of the department.
A very good morning to all and all. The president of the program, Professor 𝐭𝐴𝐬𝐺, who is the chairperson of KCHR, keynote speaker, Dr. Kalpana Kannabiran, Fashia, the program manager, Mr. Siddiq Rabia, honorary director of IUCA. So we are here for listening to the lecture which is in the name of T.H.P Chentharassery. So when I come across this name, actually it is very happy to say that we lived in a neighborhood. He was my neighbor for years together, and we used to cross or bump each other when in the roads and in the shops, in the local shops and other things. So we used to talk a bit about something, but I never knew that he was such a great scholar, especially a great historian as far as Kerala is concerned. I always consider him as, when I started reading about Chentharassery, what happens is that, I always feel that there is a person who is also, we have very close relationship, that is our earlier professor in economics, Professor 𝐐𝐮𝐞𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠. So Professor 𝐐𝐮𝐞𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐧 used to say a lot about how the caste and the subaltern communities, they are actually affected in the economic sense, but at the same time T.H.P Chentharassery, he has actually given us a lot of insights from the point of view of social circle as well as from the historical context. So we are remembering his great work, and he is actually have extended our knowledge about the Indian caste system, especially in the context of Kerala. We have our own ways of having it, and we have our social reforms which mostly surrounding the caste system which had in our state. And also we had a lot of movements which happened in the 19th century itself. Most of the movements which are there in Kerala, we all know that they are community based. And it is not only the prominent communities, but also the Dalit communities. They also had their share of movements in Kerala. So, but it is a huge task to document all those movements, and that intellectual revolution we had over the 2 centuries in Kerala has been very nicely done by Mr. T.H.P Chentharassery. So we are really fortunate to have the keynote address by Dr. Kalpana Kannabiran, where she will be talking about curing the annihilation of caste. So it is a very timely subject line with what the great T.H.P Chentharassery has done. And I don't want to stand between you and the speaker. I congratulate Mr. Siddiq for having this program, and we are very much grateful to the KCHR for accepting our invitation and hosting the program in the University of Kerala. On behalf of the Department of Economics, University of Kerala, I extend a warm welcome as well as a huge gratitude who are attending here offline. I think some of you are in online. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this.
Now I would like to invite
Do you have a time limit?
That chair has time frame.
Lectures are not time.
Good morning to all, and Jai Bhim. Professor Ganesh, Dr. Farshia, Dr. Siddiq, Madam from the Economics Department, friends from the Inter-University Center, and KCHR. I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to come to Kerala and to deliver a lecture in memory of Sri T.H.P Chentharassery. It is a unique opportunity, and I also to share my ongoing and new work on the subject of the annihilation of caste. We gather to celebrate today the scholarship of Sri T.H.P Chentharassery and his stupendous efforts to script regional social histories, Dalit histories and anti-caste histories importantly, that are attentive to the depredations of the caste orders and that resurrect histories of resistance to caste orders. This has involved importantly the writing of intellectual history, the foregrounding of the work of anti-caste philosophers like Iyengale in building anti-caste consciousness, the mapping of the spread of Dr. Ambedkar's oceanic works nationally and regionally, and the history of indigenous Indians. Unfortunately, I have not had access to his prolific writing in Malayalam and have only been able to cursory glance at his work in English, which are just two of his works. I am honored to deliver this lecture and grateful to KCHR for this invitation. In my lecture today, I will focus on a single text, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, and attempt to explore the ways in which this text helps us to speak to the dismantling of heteropatriarchal systems that are constitutive of caste orders. How might we understand the borderlands of caste, the densely intertwined lines that demarcate and proliferate within mainstream society, with communities ousted to the fringes of village or town, the Velivada as we call it in Telangana, yet incarcerated within. The edifice of caste, following the work of anti-caste philosophers, Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, E.V.R. Periyar, B.R. Ambedkar, Iyengale, Ayodhi Das, Bhagyareddy Varma, and a veritable galaxy from different vernacular and regional traditions, importantly, is built on the subjugation of women. Heterosexual patriarchy and heteronormativity, the dominion of Brahmin and dominant caste Savarna men, this is the foundation of the caste system as we all understand it and know it. Gaining independence from a colonial master does not necessarily mean the end of enslavement, cognitively, culturally, and socially, as Gandhi and Ambedkar pointed out in starkly different ways through their life and work. We find different iterations of this in the oceanic works of anti-caste philosophers, and in the voices of women who challenge the thraldom of caste and patriarchy. Rakhmabai and Tarabai Shinde bring in the element of freedom and the domestic, the deep truths of servitude and unfreedom. Our very own Dakshayani Velayudan declared that the sea has no caste. Swaraj, Satyagraha, and Dukkha are deeply connected. Dukkha in the sense of suffering, as a way of perceiving the world, suffering as a deep, searing longing for Swaraj, for emancipation, that emerges strongly from emancipatory anti-caste intellectual traditions that are embedded in our constitutional common sense. I reference here the UGC regulations and the Supreme Court stay recently. Sexuality in this formation is synonymous with heterosexual appropriation and prerogative within caste and between castes, within marriage and in non-marital sexual practices and traditions in a graded society in distinctive ways. It is also predicated on dispossession. For women and castes located at the bottom of the order, dispossession from land, labor, property, wealth, and access to resources and the commons. And on the servitude of the castes at the bottom, reinforced through practices of untouchability, which are far from dead today. Gender, caste, sexuality, kinship, family organization, tribe, community, social location, labor, citizenship, violence and racialization are all mutually interconnected, co-constituted and rooted in the material relations of production and reproduction. The harking to religious traditions is an obfuscation of the material basis of the caste system. The resistance to this appropriation and dispossession, presenting a welding of caste and gender regimes, has been unceasing through historically changing material conditions of caste orders, notably land and property, rationalized by custom and tradition, which only serve to mask the materiality of the deep oppressions of caste. It is this welded formation that I describe as the castes of gender, relational and multiplex in their profusion. In this lecture today, I extend and provide a summation of this work to argue that queering the annihilation of caste embeds the idea of annihilation in what R.W. Connell calls contradictory embodiments of the political economies of caste patriarchies. Queer and heterosexual, Savarna, Dalit and Bahujan, graded and chameleonic in their adaptability to shifting regimes of hegemony, power and dispossession. How do we dispossess and displace heteropatriarchal regimes of caste is the fundamental question that I believe the annihilation of caste addresses itself to. To quote Ambedkar, caste is a monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform, you cannot have economic reform until you kill this monster, unquote. The annihilation of caste, his text, is a program shift for a revolutionary transformation to an anti-caste utopia. Assembling arguments for reasoned resistance, it is a call to action, in form, in content, and in method. Social reform in this text is the metaphor for the revolutionary overthrow of the Hindu social order, of the Hinduism that anchors caste. In the 90 years since it was first enunciated by Dr. Ambedkar, and in the long centuries of anti-caste resistance that culminated in its enunciation, the annihilation of caste has become emblematic of a vernacular, polyglot imagination that also straddled vernacular English in its foundational moment, to trace a trajectory for emancipation crafted through struggle. The defiance of coming into consciousness or reconstructing new worldviews and fighting for liberation that Shailja Paik speaks of defines the annihilation of caste. This process and this philosophy that undergirds it advocates, I quote, social reform in the sense of reorganization and reconstruction of the Hindu society, the abolition of the caste system, not merely reform of the Hindu family, said Ambedkar. On the threshold of independence, his view that, I quote, for political revolutions to endure, social and religious revolutions must precede them, because political reformers will find that in making of a constitution, they cannot ignore the problem arising out of the prevailing social order is prescient. Equality for Dr. Ambedkar is the precondition for revolutionary solidarity, for collective struggle, as a person will only join if he is secure in the feeling that other men with whom he is acting are actuated by a feeling of equality and fraternity, and above all, of justice. Men will not join in a revolution unless they know that after the revolution is achieved, they will be treated equally, and that there will be no discrimination of caste and creed. Unquote. Dismantling the logic of religion, of labor, of embodiment, and of political organization, annihilation of caste opens up the weaponized gender fences to a gender plural, liberatory imagination of a caste-free society, and indeed of what Dr. Ambedkar calls social endosmosis. This is a very peculiar phraseology that he uses, social endosmosis. Importantly, Dr. Ambedkar uses caste to connote stratification systems elsewhere that institutionalize hierarchy more generally, be it the distinct castes of plebeians and patricians of Rome, or the caste of Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, or the constitution makers in Prussia. In doing so, he removes a consideration that is embedded in the immutability and particularity of the divine and eternally self-perpetuating Hindu theism in India. This conceptual opening up of the frontiers of caste also creates the possibility to imagine different interpretations of pasts and presents and different imaginations of futures for resistance, justice, fraternity, and indeed for the description, comprehension of nature and natural attributes. Personhood, labor, dominion, and the emotional texture of the desire for equality begins to be imagined very differently. If liberty is the goal of revolutions, it can only, and by liberty he means freedom, if liberty is the goal of revolutions, it can only be achieved by the destruction of the dominion which one man holds over another, he says. The mechanisms that fuel the caste system entrench this domination. If family organization, notably uxorial practices, that is marriage practices, is one such mechanism, as Ambedkar argues in his iconic essay Castes in India, the division of laborers, as distinct from the division of labor, a graded hierarchy which subjugates laboring persons, is another. Across both broad systemic mechanisms, that is the family with the dominion of one man and the gradation of laborers, the colonization of the body structures caste. The female body, or that over which man may exercise dominion, simply because he is a man, he says, the maker of injunctions, and the laboring body, stripped of personhood and selfhood through the performance of degrading, servile labor. That which is colonized by the Savarna self, never reducible to a body. While the laboring body is always and only reducible to a body, the Savarna body is in fact the Savarna self which prescribes selfhood, not body or embodiment in the strict sense of the term. Dr. Ambedkar's observations on graded inequalities and the division of laborers in the context of caste society interrogates the dominant premise that caste system is a division of labor. Dismantling essentialist constructions of a social and political phenomenon in terms of the natural attributes of different rungs of the caste ladder, he argues in Annihilation that the gradation of laborers serves to block mobility with recourse to a religious doctrine of predestination and the perpetuation of subordination through forced performance of degrading labor by the lowest castes, hedged in by rules of disgust, aversion, stigma, social humiliation, and the untouchability complex. The antisocial spirit, he says, smothers reflective thought. drives the caste system and obstructs empathy, compassion, and indeed fraternity. Not only is Chaturvarnya repellent, my whole being repels against it, he says, it is important to develop a reasoned critique of annihilation's target. Part of caste structural flaws is the fact that only men count. Women do not count as autonomous beings, nor, we may add, do persons who do not bear the attributes of the republic of touchable men. How does one live worthily, in glory, fight in a battle, rather than beat a retreat and surrender to captivity, he asks. The breakout from captive gender is written in to the annihilation of caste, since it is not a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire, but a notion, a state of mind. Annihilation means a notional change, not the destruction of a physical barrier. You may desegregate, you may destroy all your physical barriers through governmental notifications and declarations, but you must dismantle the notional framing of segregation in order to achieve annihilation. The positively pernicious stratification of occupations is a necessary condition for the colonization of the laboring body. The dogma of predestination decrees the performance of occupations that are regarded as degraded by the Hindus, from which there is a constant desire to evade and escape, solely because of the blighting effect which they produce on those who follow them, owing to the slight and stigma cast upon them by Hindu religion. Neither men's hearts nor their minds are in their work. The profound harms perpetrated by caste arise from the subordination of man's natural powers and inclinations to the exigencies of social rules. Marking a distinction between rules and principles, Ambedkar pitches his critique to the degeneration of Hinduism from a set of principles based on reason and intellect, justice, for instance, to a set of rules, a code of ordinances devoid of spontaneity that demand servile conformity. I must do because I am predestined to do. Servile conformity to commands. But the worst evil of this code of ordinances is that the laws it contains must be the same yesterday, today, and forever. The trauma of the trauma of degradation and its blighting effects of stigma and slight, of the refusal to allow natural powers and inclinations and the desire for escape, as well as Ambedkar's own feeling of being repelled by this system, makes Annihilation a text that speaks to the emotions of resistance that co-produce the aspiration to selfhood and the full realization of human dignity. It is through embodiment that the anti-caste, caste-free spirit is most powerfully and evocatively expressed. Reflective thought, in the sense of unfettered, active, persistent, and careful consideration, is at the core of the idea of notional change. Densely intertwined with reflective thought are reason and morality, the two most powerful weapons in the armory of a reformer. People must have the freedom to consider whether caste accords with reason and with morality. The time has come, Dr. Ambedkar says in Annihilation, to recognize that there is nothing fixed, nothing eternal, nothing sanatan, that everything is changing, that change is the law of life for individuals as well as for society. In a changing society, there must be constant revolution of old values. If there must be standards to measure the acts of men, there must also be a readiness to revise those standards, unquote. For what use is Swaraj in a caste-ridden society that obstructs solidarity and therefore the capacity to defend itself? Because it is then 100 castes. There is no solidarity, or if there is no solidarity that is possible across the castes. The anti-caste utopia that annihilation imagines is predicated, I argue, on the queering of the annihilation of caste. In an important sense, therefore, annihilation of castes stages a dismantling of the thresholds of critique that contained castes in India, his earlier text, moving also from a diagnostic mode to a revolutionary mode. In marking this shift, annihilation presents a synoptic view of Dr. Ambedkar's entire range of concerns across his oceanic oeuvre and emplaces his ideas of radical transformation along a continuum of critique. This text also importantly builds on the gender tropes contained in castes in India, enables a queer interrogation of the caste order, and produces the conceptual framework for queering the annihilation of caste. Dr. Ambedkar outlined an anti-caste praxis that pulled together the historical, genealogical, the existential, and the macrostructural materialist conditions of exploitation that powered the deep oppressions of Dalits in Hindu society, pointing specifically to the gendered regimes of caste. Gopal Guru elucidates Ambedkar's political project of annihilating caste and his archaeological method in setting about this task, reclaiming the commons for Dalits in the Chavdar tank by confronting untouchability, proclaiming a resistance against the Hindu religion that erected this barricaded social order by publicly setting fire to Manusmriti, and assembling a different spiritual intellectual tradition based on fraternity or fellowship as the core value, undergirded by dignity and equality. Dr. Ambedkar's purpose in scripting the 22 vows of Navayana Buddhism was to put in place a dialogic context and fundamental precepts tethered to reason and compassion. I also signpost Swati Shah's interrogation of the interlocked forces of caste and heteropatriarchy under Hinduism in contemporary India. She argues that this also calls for a theory of caste capitalism and a queer hermeneutic of endogamy that might enable an understanding of how caste rules are both enforced through violent social norms and at the same time selectively or intermittently ignored. Example, in spaces of non-normative sexuality and gender expression, and how both enforcing and ignoring caste rules facilitate the normative functions of caste-based endogamy. The interillumination, to use a word from Bakhtin, is transvocational and immersed in plurality. The preamble to the Constitution of India states that the Constitution secures to all its citizens fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual. Dignity and fraternity are indivisible, embedded in relationality, sociality, and the attitude of self-respect, straddling human and non-human worlds. Upendra Bakshi reminds us that the exact moment when the preamble was being drafted, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its preamble, recognizing that inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is foundation of the freedom, justice, and peace in the world, was also being drafted. I use dignity and its constellation of kin concepts, self-respect, swayamaryade, fraternity, bandhuta, and prefer to speak of bandhuta as sororal fraternity, human dignity, humanity, manuski, maitri, fellowship, and justice, to open a discussion on how we might approach queering the annihilation of caste, which presents a possibility for an utopic anti-caste social order. Anand Teltumbde traces the historical and evolutionary context for the first civil rights struggle in modern times at Mahad in 1927, although its place as the foundational moment of civil rights on the subcontinent and indeed globally with the respectable exception of the African Americans, is never acknowledged in human rights historiography. Mahad was also importantly a marker of the beginning of the independent Dalit movement, permanently associated with Baba Saheb Ambedkar, he says. It is in this respect that it has been celebrated and remembered. As Shailaja Paik observes, the Dalit movement led by Ambedkar articulated a demand for human rights through a radical anti-caste politics of suffering that built on ideas of both individual dignity and collective community dignity, through a deployment of vernacular concepts where becoming modern meant abandoning agrarian bondage and caste slavery, seeking education, employment and manuski, and becoming asli, decent and rights-bearing citizens in free India. This was a defined path coming into consciousness, reconstructing of new worldviews and fighting for liberation. This is the vantage point from which an engagement with caste and gender comes into its own. It enables the assembling of ideas emerging from movements and their mirroring in court judgments in some instances on the necessary conditions for the queering of anti-caste knowledge production and for recognizing the ways in which anti-caste philosophers must, but do not in the normal course, inform queer knowledge production. See, for instance, the work of queer Dalit scholar 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞. Dalit movements present a complex gendered cascading of Dalit resistance in support of reservations and Dalit associational freedoms and against social boycott, atrocity, forced or tied labor, untouchability, state violence, stigmatization, humiliation, and judicial abdication. The Supreme Court stay order of the UGC regulations is an excellent example of judicial abdication. We also have a history of mass mobilization around questions of land, labor, and dispossession, being followed by gruesome mass violence against Dalits. 𝐐𝐮𝐞𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 and the emergence of the Dalit Mahasabha, for instance, and the violence that followed attempts to organize around wages in Kirvanmani. We also witnessed the politics of becoming in the making, the reinvention of deeply insurgent Ambedkarite Buddhist motherhood by Radhika Vemula that challenges the Hindutva state through tenacious public protest and conversion to Buddhism in the face of grief and loss. The juridical concept of hostile environments has its beginnings in India in the case of Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan that provided a measure of redress to women against sexual harassment at the workplace based on the aggravated sexual assault, gang rape of Bhavri Devi in Rajasthan by dominant caste landlords. Although there is an amnesia with respect to the originary moment of this concept in the caste-gender complex, it helps to understand structural violence and oppression and the violence in Bhavri Devi's case being powered by the interlocking of caste and gender. In general, the diverse struggles of Dalit women against the majoritarian caste order in different states and contexts, the struggles of Radhika Vemula, the resistance of queer Dalits against Brahminical heterosexism and its attendant violence, the Christianization of Dalits as a liberatory exit from the oppressions of caste, and the mass conversions of Dalits to Islam in Haganah, and renouncing Hinduism to protest against state action in the face of sexual assault, indicate the dialogic, argumentative, and renunciant possibilities of protest and becoming. With respect to conversion to Christianity, Sundar Bhupalan observes that the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages saw many Dalits embracing Christian scripture, which for them was a move to approximate spirituality and literacy that was denied to them under Hinduism. Sanal Mohan's poignant account of Lucy's conversion spins the caste-gender complex to the center of our consideration of intersectionality, bringing together Lucy's simultaneous location in transnational contexts, missionary and slave trade, and within the Hindu social orders, slavery practices, and in liberatory contexts of conversion for a Dalit woman. And I quote from Mohan's book, Kali was purchased by a European gentleman in 1827 and was supposed to accompany him and his family to Java. She pleaded to missionaries in Cochin to let her into the missionary compound where she had reached from her hideout, since she did not want to leave her land forever. She was then baptized as Lucy in 1828, who, according to the missionaries, continued to grow in grace. Unquote. Within this historical and philosophical context, Akhil Khan persuasively argues that a Dalit pure understanding remains rooted in the violent histories of caste and the historical resistance to it. From that positionality, it works to uproot Dalit from its conformity to heteronormative ideologies of anti-caste politics. By this token, queerness is not only a political category that people use to define their sexuality, but also a mode of understanding the everydayness of sociality, which cannot happen without displacing dominant normativities on every axis. Identity, belonging, and becoming, undergirded by gender, are central to the construction of selfhood. Meenakshi Moon and Urmila Pawar recall a speech by Venutai Bhatkar, a Mahar woman, during the National Social Conference in Nagpur in 1933, in which she displayed her self-esteem and social consciousness by speaking with great determination in the presence of leaders. I'm after all an ignorant woman, she said, but I certainly feel that unless the untouchables are made touchable, we will not gain self-rule. The situation of the Mahars is very bad. I am a nurse. I don't get work. I was advised to become a Christian. Then I would have got a job. But I will not leave my caste. To steal a name, to steal a caste, this I will never do. I will stay in my caste and strive to improve it. Replete with accounts of organizing across differences between castes and between men and women, of critiquing humiliation in schools, for instance, and demanding formal education on equal terms with Savarna Hindus, of rejecting dehumanizing practices of forced dedication of Dalit girls and inequality in marriage, both, Moon and Pawar script an account and method that narrates the complex history of Dalit Ambedkarite movements and the challenges of working with heterogeneity and plural modes of belonging, alongside the universal value of human dignity within and between communities and castes and across gender. In contemporary India, we see the performance of human dignity and personhood in pure Dalit interrogations of supremacist, heterosexist caste orders under Hinduism. This moment of what I call queering the annihilation of caste may be signposted through the figure of the law in action, anti-caste imaginations of dignity informing its constitutional delineation. Upendra Bakshi suggests that the iconic case Nas Foundation versus NCT Delhi, which decriminalized homosexuality for the first time in 2009, in fact inaugurates a new jurisprudence against practices of stigmatization with the promise of multiplier effects in other arenas, making possible judicial intervention that orders emancipation from state, society, co-production of the cultural politics of stigmatization. So the law and jurisprudence can be a trigger for long durée social changes as well. A normative feat that imperils the authority of the custodians of such traditions of stigmatization. The extent of stigmatization of queer communities is evident in the Delhi High Court's application of Article 15(2) of the Constitution of India that prohibits discrimination in access to public spaces and proscribes horizontal discrimination between people inter se, understood in the normal course as protections for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Also relevant was the court's reference to the Criminal Tribes Act, a colonial legislation that criminalized nomadic and peripatetic communities, of which eunuchs were one, according to Part 2 of the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This part, Part 2, was dropped in later amended versions of this act and was then by then written into a particular legislation called the Telangana Areas Eunuchs Act in Hyderabad state that was stayed in its application only 2 years ago. The binary heterosexual entrapment of gender interlocked with criminalization based on caste, ethnicity, migratory life worlds, and deeply entrenched prejudice against persons living outside the institutions of heterosexual monogamy were the bane of caste. In this context, the reference to human dignity rests on the recognition of physical and spiritual integrity of the human being, his or her or their humanity, and their value as a person irrespective of the utility they can provide to others. It is not accidental that in deciding on decriminalization, the NAS court invoked early constitutional moves that sought to emancipate Dalits from the thraldom of caste. Ambedkar's assertion that constitutional morality will outweigh public morality, the Delhi High Court declared, even if public morality is the majoritarian view, is what must prevail. And the reference to Article 15(2), which specifically prohibits practices of segregation and apartheid in caste orders, is now banned. The significance of NAS Foundation, I argue, beyond the immediate relief it sought to provide, resides in the intersectional possibilities it holds for theorizing emancipation from caste that is weaponized by stigma, indignity, and structural violence. It steers thinking through the mechanisms of the same majoritarian regimes of stigma as they affect queer persons, communities, and other minorities. Important too is the fact that the NAS case was brought to court by queer collectives in struggle, challenging heteronormative state and society. The court, in an insurgent move, turned the challenge to normative orders around to define a new normativity based on sexually normative orders. And these new normative orders were to be based on constitutional morality and an immersive approach to human dignity. This process and the effects result in a justice cascade whose history is informed by the philosophies of caste and whose futures carry the radical possibilities of queering in its annihilation. How does a caste order structure sexual lives and gender regimes outside, on the margins of the normative heterosexual? There is a long history of gender diversity and accounts of the ways in which normative gender has been troubled and disrupted by trans persons, unsettling the status quo and dominance through persistent interrogation of settled, congealed embodiments and heterosexual hypergamous endogamy. Alongside this, as if on a parallel track, the Brahminical Odyssey, which is a wonderful phrase used by sociologist Parvatama as early as 1978, advances apace. A predatory cruise of sexual excess, appropriation, oppression, commodification, violence and humiliation that takes specific forms mediated by criminal law and civic and state impunity where queer persons and communities are concerned. This impunity strikes both the social and the individual with equal ferocity. Recent writing by queer activists and scholars redirects the heterosexual and dominant gaze to transgender worlds, rendering legible the everyday experiences, kinship reformations, and communities of belonging, faith, religion, and theology in India. The conceptual field of humiliation is immediately relevant to a deep engagement with the idea of the annihilation of caste. And here I have the stunning work of Sundar Bhupalan in mind. Pratiksha Bakshi's study of the use of the writ of habeas corpus, while we are on the subject of law, in cases of heterosexual choice marriages, underscores ways in which people use law in the intimate realms of private life, famously described in a case of the Delhi High Court as a china shop into which the bull, which is the constitution, must not enter. This illustrates how narratives of love are entangled in procedural law, how sovereignty is defined in relation to love, and how love labors in the punitive corridors of power, of law, and allows us to highlight the nature of custodial power over women by their natal families in alliance with state and non-state bodies of law and governance. And we also witnessed in Kerala the Hadia case. Applying Bakshi's arguments on heterosexual marriage to the use of the writ of habeas corpus in the case of lesbian women, Poniyarasu and Priya Thangaraja point to an important distinction in the stated reasons for opposition by the respective families. For heterosexual couples, it is a question of non-acceptance by parents, while for lesbian couples, it is condemned on the ground of immorality and criminality. And yet, using habeas corpus to challenge societal attitudes in courts, they suggest, contributes to the imagination of new feminist legal languages and spaces, new desires, intimacies, and even rights. Anand Teltumbde inflects the discussion on sexuality and choice with the ways in which punitive corridors of law interlock with the carceral regimes of caste to imprison young Dalit and Muslim men for daring to enter relationships of choice with women outside the Dalit fold, based on preliminary observations in his time in Taloja jail, bringing another layer into the long-standing discussion on natal violence against adult daughters entering into relationships outside caste and community across the country. Autobiographical accounts of trans persons from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and more recently Kerala reflect on the unraveling of human dignity and the right to privacy in public spaces that register trans persons through acts and attitudes of public humiliation that range from the hostile gaze to assault, recalling the significance of Article 15(2) rights to trans peoples, hijras, and Tirunangas. A critical arena where the politics of belonging plays out, and indeed an arena where the feminists construct the personal is the political, makes most meaning is the family. In India as elsewhere, neoliberalism has tied in neatly with the rise of strident, violent majoritarian nationalism in mainstream politics and government. The enforcement of narrow definitions of patriotism, of endogamy, of the resurgence of hate crimes, recovering women through the perpetration of violence and honor crimes marks this moment, as we witness in the new war cry of the nation, Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Gangs patrol streets and villages, towns and cities, policing food cultures in the name of Hindu religion, and enforcing Ghar Wapasi and Love Jihad on Hindu girls marrying outside caste and community, if necessary through murder on the streets. Families are under siege in the age of Hindu. Are these crises, or are they constitutive of the family or families at specific social and historical conjunctures? What are the conceptual disruptions forced on feminist and queer explorations of the family? What are the ruptures affected through Dalit and Dalit queer interrogations of the heteropatriarchal Hindu family? We can scarcely forget that gender orders are constituted through systematic practices of violence at various levels. Which then are the texts that should form the foundational corpus for family studies in India? As a sociologist, this is a concern for me. That will adequately explain the intractability of caste and gender and their complex conjunctions, and that will help us interrogate fundamentalist and majoritarian enforcement of family forms, violent proscriptions on child marriages, and the persistent problems of gender-based violence. There have been debates over whether marriage and marital rights offer any resolution to discrimination against queer persons, especially after the marriage equality case in the Supreme Court. These debates underscore the pitfalls of legal recognition of and institutional arrangements around intimate relations, and caution against the shifting of targets of discrimination to those who continue to live outside marriage, irrespective of sexual identity and preference. Should not inheritance, guardianship, parental benefits, workplace rights, all forms of employment, reproductive rights, for instance, flow equally to LGBTQI persons? Should such rights not be affirmed, irrespective of caste and irrespective of relationship status? These questions are material to a feminist, queer, and Ambedkarite understanding of the institution of marriage in general. Is marriage a necessary institution at all? Is it not built on a fundamentally unequal and exclusionary principles? Within marriage, should arranged, namely endogamous marriages, exist at all? Should marriage only be based on choice? Is it possible to advocate choice without rejecting marriage? Is a secular provision in the Special Marriages Act sufficient? Or should there be a reframing of religious laws on marriage and family? The marriage equality case, Suprio versus Union of India, crystallizes questions of desirability of queer marriages, with opinions ranging from rejection of marriage and monogamy to advocating choice to endorsing endogamous queer unions. So you have queer unions, but Brahmins within Brahmins, and so on and so forth. How can we possibly escape caste, community, and class in India? How may we revert gender plurality to the elaboration of anti-caste politics? Dalit queer persons and trans persons accounts speak to the dual and interlocked stigmatization of transness, and yet in their very embodiment, transgendered persons reinscribe through an inversion the normative binary constituents of maleness and femaleness, thus disrupting and troubling gender lines. There has been some recognition in social research of the complexity of gender formations, but not adequately. We have in India a series, and I won't go into the details of that, we have a series of writings by Dalit trans persons talking about the ways in which you interread queer rights with the questions of the annihilation of caste that Dr. Ambedkar raises. One of the major points has been to reject the classification of all trans persons, like in the transgender persons, rights of transgender persons bill, as a backward class, and instead recognize the fact of caste gradations within trans persons and give them the benefit of horizontal reservations, which will recognize diverse locations, till such time as we achieve the annihilation of castes. The Equality Lab's report on caste in the US points to the historical emergence of the racialization of caste in the early 20th century Hindu diaspora. The failure by South Asians to meet the standards of whiteness set out in the Immigration Act 1924 in the United States, according to this report, led to Indian men challenging their exclusion in immigrant courts in 1924. The first cases were brought by upper caste migrants, immigrants, A.K. Mojumdar and Bhagat Singh Thind, both of whom argued that they passed the whiteness test because they identified themselves as high caste Hindus of full Indian blood. They explained that because they were upper caste and had pure Aryan blood, and that those racial origins were something that they historically shared with Caucasians, Mojumdar was granted citizenship on the basis of this argument. This was after the publication of Ambedkar's Castes in India. The challenge to the reproduction of caste orders in the Indian diaspora, therefore, is an ongoing one, as evidenced in the work of Tenmoyi Sundararajan. Cutting through the thick description and analysis of the ways in which transsexualities are embedded in the local, challenging claims to a universal global framing of transness and queerness, trans narratives represent questions of embodiment, performativity, risk, speech, voice, and anti-caste resistance in deeply subversive and poignant ways. The question of enduring and durable justice, of the incessant reasoned change and social transformation that Ambedkar calls for in the annihilation of caste, may be addressed through the transgressive praxis of Abrahmani trans-queer negotiations that offer new ways of rupturing and disrupting normativities across identities and locations, across borders of different orders, in the quest for social endosmosis. Thank you.
The lecture concludes by itself, but in the KCHR lectures, we permit questions. So, if you are... Absolutely. Okay. The only person I should ask is the lecturer herself, because she will have to answer questions. So, I think questions are... See, you can ask questions. I think to start off, I think I will myself start with the thing of questioning, because we'll sit here and ask questions. In general, I endorse your argument, but I would, I'm not a sociologist nor a legal scholar. I'm basically a history person. So, from a historian's position, I would like to ask 2 or 3 problems. The one is the problem regarding the position taken by some scholars and some activists also regarding the anti-caste positions actually going by a transmutation into some other religion. The problem with all religions is that they have all been bred and grown in conditions of inequality, and they have also bred inequality on their own. As a result, you see, you are going from one religion to other. Even if it has an emancipatory mode at some particular point of time, which I don't reject, is not a solution to your problem about, you see, the actual annihilation of caste. So that point has not been discussed in detail by some of the scholars. They seem to think that this particular transition itself solves the problems, which it does not. So that is, in fact, some of our discussions here in Kerala also have pointed to the same thing. That is one problem. And if, for example, Ambedkar's recourse to Buddhism. I think he put it in a very different sense from what one would call as religion, because he did not take it up as a question of Buddhism as a religious discourse at all. So that is something very different. But otherwise, the whole question of transmitting one religion to the other does not solve any problems. That is one thing. Second issue is the whole question of legal. Legal scholar. See, the question of resolution or of issues that are related to long periods of social fracturing through legal methods is one thing that I think that is very important. Even Ambedkar seems to have supported for his own reasons the constitutional morality versus the public morality. See, there the whole question of legality becomes very important. Even now, much of the discussions on annihilation of caste, or actually the question of caste questions, as well as gender questions, seem to be sort of trapped in the legal discourse. Is that the way to solve it? Because law, in the long run, has been an instrument of the state, and an instrument of those who actually rule. It doesn't represent, law doesn't represent the ruled. And again, I'm talking in terms of history. We have not yet had a law where the ruled is actually represented in the law, which means that is legal discourse the real solution to the rule. Because the whole problem of gender and the inclusion, exclusion, the type of laws that have been promulgated, and the debates regarding such laws themselves. So that all shows that probably the whole question does not come in the ambit of law itself. It's probably much more basic revolutionary social change that seems to be more important than law. That is one thing. A third discussion is regarding how we discuss sexuality. And this is something which is, see, now the whole thing has got trapped in again another form, gender. Now gender has got its own connotations in sociological terms, in cultural terms, in legal terms, etc. So it has got its own connotations. Now the question of sexuality is something that is more basic in one more sense, primarily because it affects the survival of a species in some way or the other. As you said yourself, the question of relations of production and reproduction becomes very important. If that is so, should not we actually conceive of sexuality embedded in some other form other than the present day's discussions on law, etc.? Whether we should have sexuality actually embedded in not in identities, communities, etc., and probably the way in which people work and labor. The whole question of human interactions in society, social interactions as such. And that is the whole thing comes in, because once you embed sexuality as a form of reproduction, it becomes something very different from the way in which sexuality is identified in gender. So that is something which I think we have to discuss also. Once it is done, then queering does not become a problem at all. Primarily because queering is just another activity of intimacy. That is about all. Queering does not become a problem at all, because queering becomes a problem when you relate it to marriage, when you relate it to progeny, reproduction, everything, then only queering becomes a problem. Otherwise, queering just becomes another form of intimacy in which people enter into in the course of their livelihoods, that's all. So that is possibly one way of looking at things, and probably I think these are some of the problems which I encountered in this presenting. I think others will have their own.
Since it is three big.
Thank you, Professor Ganesh. Actually, those are they're fundamental problems that
we are constantly in search of resolutions for. On the question of religion, and in fact, on all three questions, I am in broad agreement with you. And I think that on the question of religion, conversion is one resolution along a continuum. It is not the final resolution. And it is also a resolution that enables you to, and this is basically how I have understood, individual acts of conversion and group acts of conversion at particular moments, episodic moments, yeah. That it is a resolution at a particular moment that offers a reprieve, that is an emotional and a political reprieve from the oppressions that you are experiencing within the religion that you are living in. And of course, the question of hope is what drives conversion. That this is the oppression you are expressing, and you don't actually know what forms of oppression you might encounter after you convert. And that is a struggle that will only commence after the act of living in another religious spiritual space begins. The difference, of course, will be if, for instance, in the manner in which Dr. Ambedkar enters Buddhism, not merely entering Buddhism, but actually redefining the boundaries of the practice of Buddhism that he envisages, to write into it, to write into his new vows, very concrete ways in which the resistance to the oppressions of the Hindu order are written in. But again, those are changes that he anticipates, and are those changes something that are those changes realized in the immediate aftermath of communities converting? We don't know. But do they actually provide communities that have converted with more with an emotional attachment to a liberatory position? This there is clear evidence of. People actually do experience a sense of freedom at not being constrained by the scaffolding of caste. So if you can only remove the scaffolding of caste by conversion, then surely that is the way, that's the direction in which you will move. The problem also comes with the fact that you don't always escape the scaffolding of caste by conversion. And this has been the experience of communities that have converted to Islam. It's been experiences of communities that have converted to Christianity. And particularly with Christianity, we know, for instance, there are studies in Tamil Nadu. I myself had done one many years ago of the Jesuit church. There's also practices in Andhra and everywhere else where it's not really the community that matters. It is the caste that matters. You can be ready Hindu and ready Christian, and then you will not have a problem. But if you are ready Christian and it's Dalit Hindu, then you have a problem. So the question of the supremacy, to what extent does conversion actually upstage caste supremacy and the oppressions tied to caste supremacy. I think that remains a very, very difficult question. And a lot of the work and the efforts around conversion and the scholarship around conversion basically tries to navigate a path. What is the rationale that people find to move, and how does that rationale actually mark a departure from the history of oppressions that they have already experienced? And I find that story in Sanal Mohan's book, I mean, it's a very small little story, you know, but these kinds of stories actually just open a window for you. You know what? So yeah, I mean, you escape from a situation of slavery, and then you are converted, and suddenly you are not slave anymore. What does that actually mean? If I am entrapped in slavery, what does just that act of stepping out of that scaffolding mean in real terms to me? And I think that basically, you know, also as a sociologist, what I'm looking for is stories that open windows for us to search further. We may not actually find the solutions, and the search has really gone on for a very long time. I mean, even anti-caste struggles have a very, very long history, and there have been so many twists and turns in looking for a better, more robust idea of freedom. So yeah, it is an unresolved question. On law, I have, you know, two positions that go together. One, of course, that law can't be the stick through which you beat people into reform. It doesn't work. Because the minute you try to do that, then there will be this cry about misusing the law, obstructing the law, and misinterpreting it. And then the question of who is capable of interpreting it correctly, who is capable of using it correctly, all of these questions come up. But in my work with, particularly with Dalit and Adivasi groups in Andhra Pradesh, what I have found, I mean, and from my position of being in the profession of law and going into court and fighting a case, I might win it, I might lose it. There are equal chances, and neither winning nor losing depends really entirely on whether I have argued well or not. There are too many factors that go into winning and losing a case. But from the standpoint of the groups that are filing the FIRs or filing the petitions in courts for land or for, I know that just the act of stepping there, registering an FIR or signing an affidavit in court to say this land that has been occupied is mine and this court has to spend time hearing my case, is itself experienced as something that allows them the opportunity to challenge, which they do not have if they do not have that ability to go and actually register the FIR. They are not deluding themselves in saying that if I register this FIR, this man will go to jail. They know that that may not well happen. 90% of the cases it won't happen. But just the fact that if I am suffering injury or harm, I can in fact go and register and name the person and force a public procedure to reckon with my grievance itself is extremely liberatory, and that is the reason why we have an absolute insistence on using the case or using the, for instance, the Prevention of Atrocities Act as one of them, or the Protection of Civil Rights Act,
of using these in the event of harm and grievance. And where the law is concerned, and this is the second part of it, where the law is concerned, I think we're actually talking about two frames of the law. So when Dr. Ambedkar is talking about constitutional morality, he is talking about sensibility, law in the sense of a sensibility for justice that has percolated down through movements that have asserted justice claims across decades and centuries. And that is the background within which the Constitution is then enacted with justiciable and non-justiciable parts. So there is a law in the sense of a sensibility of justice, and that sensibility of justice is what constitutional morality in fact embodies. So when we insist on that constitutional morality should prevail and not public morality, we are saying step out of your narrow parochial frames and try and think of a sensibility of justice that a free country should practice. So it's a larger philosophical claim that he is making over there. And I think that also in asking for a constitutional, for a rule of law by the Constitution in a sense, we are simultaneously addressing both the frames. One is specific in terms of does this law make a difference to the society I'm living in? And second, should we and to what extent should we share in a sensibility of justice? Which is a larger philosophical question that is embedded beneath this specific legal claim. On reproduction and sexuality and peering, I think yes, basically there should, we are talking about removing rules that are carceral and thinking of sexuality and relationship in terms of a larger social order where there will be reproduction, there will be sexuality that enables reproduction, sexuality that doesn't enable reproduction. There will, you will have a diverse range of sexual expressions, none of which need necessarily be stigmatized, and all of which can be based on the question of choice, not undergirded either by caste or by classifications of binary oppositions between the sexes. I may answer the questions.
Yeah. Now the floor is open. Actually, I also have a small, because this is actually an anxiety when we use law as both the liberator as well as this can also be used as a weapon to oppress. This is what is actually the UGC example which we have discussed. Even after the annihilation of caste, the 90 years or whatever history, we are still not able to both empirically and conceptually tackling this issue of how we are going to basically have a resolution to come out of this, what you call the compartmentalized system. So this is what is actually the whole point of when the so-called the Savarna bodies are protesting against a resolution or a regulation or a law in one way. And the court was actually kind of so positive in one way. So how this can actually, this is actually throughout the history, this is this giving as well as taking, using it as an oppression as well as as a means is happening. So I think how one can actually resolve this sort of an issue. This is a small, this is an anxiety which is indeed deep-rooted in the very discussion of all of us. Thank you. If any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
My question is about the solution that Ambedkar had indicated in the Annihilation of Caste about the removal of the dependence on the scriptures, how the sort of justification that the Hindu scriptures are given for caste. So the justification that the Hindu scriptures are given to caste, so that has to be removed. It was one way that he had indicated. So how does that change with query? I mean, is there a change in that also required? Are you proposed? Your comments about that?
You have a question.
Now I am from Andhra Pradesh. The Dalits are converted into Christianity. Why? What is the reason, main cause of? They nowadays also no entry to temple. That's only they converted. And also they don't know what is the what are the constitutional laws. That's only they do not directly go to court or that's the situation. And nowadays also these are the minorities and suppress their rights. But the case is they have no unity. Means in case of Telangana, the one politician, Mandakish Mali, that's man. These have Marias and Malas in high suppress their rights, untouchables. But they want separate their caste and they want separate reservations. This is the situation. What? How do we solve? These politicians are dividing these caste uses something. What is that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, on whether the law being used as oppression, tool of oppression and liberation both, that is the law serves the function of a regulatory apparatus, and it will be used in both ways. Yeah, the effort that it will be used in both ways also because every single person living within a particular territory that is governed by a set of laws must be able to claim access and protection of that law. Every single person, irrespective of social status, standing, whatever. Which means that there will be people of different, from different classes, there will be people of different social locations who will necessarily appeal to the court. Yeah? But just because the court decides in favor of repressive laws doesn't really mean that the liberatory potential of law is diminished, because the trouble with the court, and I don't think there's any reason for anxiety. I mean, I say that because I'm kind of in that system. There's really no reason for anxiety there because it is an incessant process, and it is through the process that you discipline courts and petitioners incessantly. Yeah, and you of course will have students like the students who went and campaigned against the UGC regulations. Like you had students in the anti-mandal agitations as well, very belligerent and so on, who will oppose reservations but claim EWS quota. Yeah, they will claim EWS quota, they will claim sports quota, they will claim teachers quota, they will claim regional quota, but they will observe, they will say we are against reservations. And the minute you come into university, are you reserved candidate or merit candidate? But never mind that you've come through EWS or any of the other hundreds of quotas in the general category. you will automatically classify yourself as merit, and anybody who comes in through SC, ST, BC reservation will be classified as reserved category. But that is the logic of the way in which caste plays itself out when public spaces come to be claimed as belonging equally, irrespective of social station. Yeah? And that is a fight we have to fight. You know, I mean, so the question about the annihilation of caste, yes, it's 90 years, but I don't think it's 90 years, it's a lot of bloodshed, it's been extremely traumatic and painful, but I don't think we have an option. Equality is not the easy way out, and there is no easy way out to equality. You know, and it is blood and gore, and one has to fight that fight. So we actually don't have an option. And one of the things that I keep repeating is that we, in every society in one way or another, but in our society, we are schooled into practices of discrimination on many counts. Yeah, and it is that process of deschooling which is the most difficult, and which constantly keeps rolling back. So you never have a one-time solution. It is a constant struggle that must keep getting reinvented by every generation. It is part of the social process and part of every generation to build an equal society. An equal society is not a once and for all achievement. Yeah, I think the mistake that we often make is to say, okay, we fought this 90 years ago, we wrote this 80 years ago, we wrote this 40 years ago, and you know, we are still talking, we are not talking about the same thing. We are talking about similar problems at a different time. And we have to. In every era, there is a push towards inequality. There is a push towards discrimination. And the reason why we have frameworks, which I wouldn't even call the constitutional law, the reason why we have frameworks like the Constitution, which sounds very utopian, is because we do need a utopian framework against which to measure our advances, however small they may be, towards equality. You know? And the current example, for instance, that I will give is that with this government in place and with this kind of UGC regime in place over 10 years, that these two mothers who lost their children were still able to force the UGC to pass these regulations. That they had them drafted, that the UGC actually passed it, and that they went to court and to the UGC to make sure it's not a mean achievement. In the face of that achievement, this protest is nothing. You know? So I think that we also need to be able to gauge what the conceptual leaps are that we are making. Sometimes we are so dissipated by what seems repetitive that we underestimate the conceptual leaps that we have actually made. And we will see change in very, very small ways all around us. The idea is, and our own lives have to be built around the purpose of expanding those little spaces. You know, if I believe, no, this is something, there's no way, you know, I can't expand the space, then I might as well just lie down and die, you know. I have to be able to say, okay, there is a path here, maybe I follow this path. At the end of it, I may find it's a dead end, but I have to follow it through and then search for a way out. It is an incessant struggle. Yeah. On annihilation, and you know, I think if you look at the testimonies and the memoirs of queer scholars, particularly queer Dalit scholars, it's very clear that they are challenging the caste order and they're challenging the gender order, both of which Dr. Ambedkar also challenges in very fundamental ways. So I don't think there's a contradiction there. The fact that annihilation speaks of upstaging the Hindu social order, and then you have castes in India that has already spoken of the fact that this social order is predicated on caste, is predicated on marriage practices within caste, particularly endogamy. The root is already there for a reasoning of saying, if we challenge marriage practices, if we challenge endogamy, there's no caste. If we challenge endogamy, challenging endogamy can as well be a challenge of heterosexuality. And then you're challenging caste is already a challenge of the Hindu social order. Can you envisage? So the crux of the question then, can you envisage a Hindu social order that does not is not structured by the logic of caste? That is really the basic question. On Madhika Dandora, actually to come out very clean, I support subclassification. Okay, so that's my position, my political position. Why do I support subclassification? And this is not about Krishna Madhika, or his campaign, but in any society. In Maharashtra you will find it with the Mahars, in the north you will find it with the Chamars, in Andhra you will find it with the Malas. In any society, we can't forget the fact that what Dr. Ambedkar also says is that caste is a system of graded inequality. It's not only in the Varna categories that you have a gradation, but in every caste you have a gradation and you have a hierarchy. That hierarchy may not get expressed in terms of untouchability as you move lower down in the caste hierarchy, but it will definitely get expressed in terms of marriage practices, endogamy within a particular subcaste, and it will also get expressed in terms of preponderance in education and public employment. Please look at enrollment. What is the Madhika Dandora's politics based on? If you look at figures of education and employment, the figures of Malas in public employment and education are way ahead. Madhikas are a minuscule proportion. All that the subclassification struggle says is, just as we are asking for reservations proportionate to population within the broad categories of SC and ST, within those categories as well, ensure that the same process of democratization is set in motion. And it takes the form of a movement only when there is a resistance. If there was no resistance and everyone just said, okay, let's just make sure that there is a reasonable representation of all castes, then there would not be a question of discrimination. So the discrimination here is not by Mandakrishna Madhika. Let's not displace the question there. Mandakrishna Madhika is representing the interests of the Madhikas who don't find jobs and seats. They are under 10% in the reserved category. So he is not discriminating. That he is building a movement in order to combat what he sees not necessarily as discrimination but inequality in representation. And I think that these are terms that are quite specific. When you're talking about inequality in representation, it's not the same as discrimination. And I do think, like I said, equality is not an easy route to take. And for many of us, whether Savarna, Dalit, Adivasi, whoever, for many of us, equality involves personal costs. You may not get a job because you are Mala. You may not get a job because you are Savarna. And somebody else may get a job because they belong to a reserved category and they are higher on the merit list in the reserved category than you are in the general category. But they are not taking your jobs. They are getting it in that category, you don't get it in yours. So you don't pit yourself against each other. But equality involves personal costs. It is a difficult route. But there is no choice. Equality is not a choice.
Just one question. So, what I heard from the key takeaways, if I were to take from the lecture, I saw a bit of annihilation of caste for queer politics. But when I heard the title and also listened, is there something, what is queering of annihilation of caste means? Does it also mean some reinterpretation of annihilation of caste or some expansion to annihilation of caste? Is there that part, is there some takeaway in that sense? Because, or say, if I were to say queering anti-caste politics, is there some takeaway? Because the part at the end when you talked about anti-caste politics for annihilation of caste for queer politics, that critique came out well, and that is what Ambedkar also says, that you cannot form a community, so even in a pure community there is going to be caste. But the other thing, what is the key takeaway? Is there something that annihilation of caste can learn from queer politics, or anti-caste politics can learn from queer politics? Is that something you wanted to communicate?
Yeah, basically, I think the reason why I call it the queering of the annihilation of caste is because annihilation of caste speaks primarily to heterosexuality. The text speaks to heterosexuality. While questioning monogamy, while questioning monogamy, while questioning endogamy, while questioning the gradation of castes, the potential for the potential to interpret it as a text that stages queering as an answer to heterosexual endogamy is one that remains implicit. It's not explicit. And so my limited project was really to point to that the implicit arguments in annihilation of caste that actually stage its queering and make it an anti-caste queer text.
One more question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, this is the last question.
Hello, ma'am. How can we create a more inclusive movement against caste oppression?
Then that's the biggest question, and I think I only tried to address myself to a very small part of it. But I actually can't. I mean, frankly, I can't begin to answer it because that's
that is the large goal of social transformation. And that is the larger goal that annihilation of caste in fact addresses itself to, and makes a beginning in addressing itself to. And I believe that that is the direction in which all of us should move. Yeah. I know that I haven't answered your question, sorry.
Hello. I just want to reflect on it's like from my experience, especially from my archival research and all. So, ending caste oppression is a kind of, continuous politics, I think so. As you said that, there are different kinds of diverse form of struggles of oppressed people, how they fought against legally and otherwise against caste. So, marking the history of caste or caste oppression itself is a very big politics, I believe, especially when we are in the contemporary society. In every university, everyday students are, not only students, even teachers are facing various kind of caste discrimination. So in this context, I'm thinking that in Kerala also we have a lot of history which should be marked, because I think most of the this history of oppression should be studied from the point of view of intersectionality. And I found that when in Malabar a lot of lower caste people were converting into Islam. In Travancore there were a kind of tension, there were a group of Izhavas trying to convert into Sikhism. So government, Travancore ruler was, it's like trying to stop it. So it's a kind of, that, there were a larger kind of protests that was happening in Travancore during the time, because they were not, these people were not allowed to, walk through the public space or entering into the schools or temples and lots of things. So there are a lot of historical kind of records which should be studied by the students. I think if they look at into the archival materials, there are possibility to talk about the kind of discrimination people in Kerala faced. So it should be studied, and we should talk about again and again to, to fight against it. It's a kind of constant fight, I think. So thank you very much for your enlightening presentation.
Just a brief comment, this is my personal, it's a personal problem, personal comment. See, I think that the term which we use very often today to cut across various kinds of oppressions and discriminations, that is intersectionality, is, I think, a very weak kind of, theoretical position. To me, it is very, very weak. That's the only thing which I consider. So I think we should really review this whole concept. I appreciate Kimberly Crenshaw, but it's a very weak concept. Anyway, that is my basic position. I use a very hackneyed old argument which Ambedkar will never approve of. I use the word dialectics. Thank you.
Dignitaries on the dais and dear colleagues and friends. As Honorable Director Professor Dinesh Lee was inconvenient to attend the session, I am here to deliver the vote of thanks. I am Fascia PS Academic Coordinator for KCSD. It's my distinct honor and privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on this solemn and memorable occasion, the second annual memorial lecture in honor of Chentharassery. First and foremost, on behalf of Kerala Council for Historical Research, I would like to express our profound gratitude to our distinguished resource person, Dr. Kalpana Kannabiran, for an insightful and moving lecture on curing the annihilation of caste. Your words have not only enriched our understanding, but have also beautifully captured the spirit and legacy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's idea of social endosmosis and its relevance to anti-caste and pure imaginations of sociality that challenge the deeply entrenched anti-socialities of caste. Thank you, ma'am. Heartfelt thanks also go to our chairperson, Professor Ken Ganesh, for gracing this occasion with your esteemed presence and words of encouragement. I would like to thank the organizing committee here in Inter-University Center for Alternative Economics, especially Professor Siddiq Rabiat, Honorable Director for Inter-University Center for Alternative Economics, and Dr. Christabel, Head of the Department for Economics, for your kind support for coordinating the event. And I extend my sincere thanks to all the staff members of Kerala Council for Historicals for their efforts to organize this event, especially Pooja, Sharif, and other colleagues. Without their dedication, an event of this magnitude would have not been possible. Finally, but not least, my sincere thanks to all of you, the wonderful audience, for your presence and patient attention. Thank you once again for making this event a memorable event. Thank you very much.